Hi there, hope you're well. Today we're looking at 3 ways to make your groove sound better. There's lots of different things to factor in what makes a groove sound good and what makes your playing sound good. And as we progress as drummers ourselves, we start to pick these things up bit by bit. Whether that's through listening back to yourself, through recording, or from feedback from other people. And just as your general musicianship improves, you start to work on these things bit by bit. So it's not a magic solution. These things take time. All of us, doesn't matter how good you are, we still work on these things to make the simple stuff sound better and really fine tune your playing. So here's a few ideas to get you started, a few things to think about that you can start to work into your practice. The first tip is balancing your volume. Your drum kit is essentially a collection of individual instruments that are arranged for one person to play at the same time. So this means that you're not just playing the drum kit, you're playing these individual instruments, and they all have to be given focus and attention individually to make them sound good together. Learning to self-mix is a crucial part of being a good sounding drummer. Being aware of the volume of each individual drum as you play them together in a groove. In whatever musical context or situation you're in, you need to think about which voices of the kit need to be more dominant and which ones need to sit back to achieve a good balance to the sound. So in the context of a rock or a pop groove, the kick and the snare really need to be the most dominant parts of the drum sound. They generally lay the foundation for everything else that's going to happen in the song and help the music drive forward. So it's important that you don't let the cymbals, whether you're playing on the hi-hat or you're playing on the ride, you don't let the cymbals overpower the kick and snare. Think of having like a mixing desk in your head as you're playing with the faders, right? So the kick and snare need to be above the cymbals. You need to tuck the cymbal sound underneath the kick and snare. If it goes the other way, it's going to start sounding really sloppy and it's quite annoying when the cymbals are too loud, like this. Whereas if you tuck the cymbals underneath or behind the kick and snare, whether you think of it in these terms, thinking of it being behind or being above, you're trying to make the cymbals less dominant in the groove, like this. It's also important to keep the kick and snare balanced in relation to each other. Try and keep them quite even when you're playing a rock or a pop song. Try and keep the kick and snare at the same volume as each other. To think of it in a different context, when you play jazz, it's generally the other way around. Now, I'm no jazz drummer, so I'm making a sweeping generalization here. But usually when you hear jazz and swing, the cymbals are the more dominant voices on the kit. So you'll hear the ride pattern, the ting, ting, ta ting, ting, ta ting, and the stepped hi-hat on the 2 and 4. They generally need to be much louder than the kick and snare, which is usually doing the comping work with a feathered kick drum and light snare hits, something like this. Rather than Anyway, that's enough jazz for now. Let's move on to the next tip. Tip number 2 is consistency. In most forms of music, we are required to repeat the same thing over and over. So as we do that, we need them to sound the same each time we play them. This means you have to put more intention behind your playing and be really aware of every note that you play. And part of that is just being accurate, hitting the middle of the drums In a groove context, I'm thinking more about the snare drum here, but hitting the snare dead center every time is going to help you produce the same sound consistently. If your stick's wandering around and you're hitting a different part of the snare drum, it's going to sound something like this. Whereas if you hit dead center every time, you'll get something that sounds more like this. Being consistent on the cymbals requires you to really listen to what you're doing and make choices and play with intention. Think about whether you're using the tip of the stick on the hi-hat or the ride, or you're using the shoulder of the stick to really lay into the edge of it. Are you playing on the bell of the ride or the edge? Do you want more attack from the sound, or do you want it more washy? The hi-hats, like how closed or how open are you going to play them? You've got to make those sound choices to suit the groove that you need to play. So here's an example of a few different hi-hat tones, playing different parts of the hi-hat and using different parts of the stick. And the same on the ride. As you go between the bell and the edge and play everywhere in between, you'll get different tones. Okay, tip number 3 is motion. This point is a super critical part of playing drums well. And it's honestly something that I didn't think about for years and years from when I started playing. Becoming aware of how you move up while you're playing is a total game changer. How you set up each note as you lift up is going to determine the quality of that note all around. So everything from your tempo to your dynamics, that's all going to be set up in how you move up, how far you move up, how quickly you move up, and also how you move up in relation to what your other limbs are doing at the time. So we've probably all encountered this problem at some point. As you try to play 2 drums in unison, like the kick in the hi-hat, or the snare in the hi-hat, or the kick in the snare, anytime you need to play 2 notes at the same time, we can get this flamming effect where they don't land at the same time, the notes are slightly apart. The remedy to this is all in the upward motion. If you rest your right stick on the hi-hat and your right foot on the kick pedal, you've got to move everything up to play a note. So if you lift both of those and they're out of sync, then the chances are they're going to come down out of sync here and get this. Whereas if you focus on lifting them both together at the same time, then they'll drop at the same time. If you get the upward motion correct, the down usually takes care of itself. You can see how this works in the context of playing a groove. So to think of this in a slightly more advanced way, one of the reasons why it's usually difficult to start placing kicks and snares on the 16th note, on the E and the A, is because you're now having to play those notes in between the 8th note hi-hats. This means you've got to think of those movements in the opposite way now. You're going to have to lift your right foot or your left hand in the opposite direction to what your right hand's doing on the hi-hat to make those notes land in between. Try and work into your practice just some awareness of this. Just start to be more aware of it as you play, and it'll go a long way into helping you play with better timing, better dynamics, and literally feeling locked in as you play in your groove. Okay, so there's 3 tips on how to play better grooves. These are all ongoing things. Like I said before, they're not magical solutions where you're going to just do it once and it happens. This all happens over time, and you've got to learn how to work this stuff into your practice. So you start to listen to yourself more, you start to watch yourself more, you start to feel what you're doing when you're thinking of these motion concepts. It just takes time, and there's no end to it really. We all practice playing time and playing groove and just trying to make it better, make things feel better, make things sound better. And as a bonus tip, tip number 4, practice with a click. I don't need to go into that in any detail, just practice with a click. Thanks for watching. Please give this video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.